Your healthy radio addiction starts now.
Power to the people!
The Laura Ingraham Show.
I am so happy to be talking to Jim Warner Wallace from the Laura Ingraham Show, who has written a book that just caught my eye when it arrived in our studios here. It's called A Cold Case Christianity. And Jim Warner Wallace is a homicide detective who was an atheist. And he started having questions about God, his faith, his belief system, and he decided to apply what he learned in all of his years investigating brutal and violent crimes to the Gospels. You know, we all come to our faith in different ways. I became a Catholic about 10 years ago now, and it was a circuitous path, but nevertheless I got there, and someday I'll write about it. But it's always interesting to examine people's faith journey, and this book is fascinating. He joins us now, and I'm delighted he's with us. Jim, how are you? Great to talk to you.
Well, I'm the one who's delighted because I'm such an awe, and I'm a huge fan of yours, so I'm so glad to be with you today.
Oh, well, how did you go from investigating murders to writing a book about Christianity with, by the way, with photos and, I should say drawings that include victims lying face down in a pool of blood, a knife in the back, multiple stab wounds? I'm looking at this going, well, how is this a book about faith again?
Well, you know what? I've had a weird journey like you were saying. You know, for me, I first became interested in Jesus just as a guy who maybe had some ancient wisdom that I could learn from, that I could mine out of the Gospels. But the problem, of course, is that I read through the Gospels, I started to recognize properties in the Gospels that I thought were very similar to properties of eyewitness accounts where you've got more than one witness of a crime. And that started me on a journey using all the tools that I used to investigate murders, you know, in the past, because I do only cold cases, so my cases are from like 1979 to 1988, right in that range. And so I started using those tools to investigate this event in the distant past, for similarly, no eyewitnesses can testify to this right now, and there is no forensic evidence. We have to make a case circumstantially, and that's what I try to do in the book, and show how that system, that tool set, actually works as you... Look, Laura, you talk all the time on this show about the values as a culture that we hold. They're largely Judeo-Christian values, and they're under attack. And it seems to me that they're under... If you can undermine the system that provides these values, Christianity, you can easily dismiss the values that come from that system. And so I think my effort was to kind of look back and say, is there a good reason to believe that any of this is true? If there is, there's good reason for us to listen to what it has to say.
Well, let's talk point by point. What was the first piece of the investigative puzzle that you started to examine when it comes to Christianity and believing in Christ?
Well, I started to recognize what I call unintentional eyewitness support. There's a pastor in the 1900s named J.J. Blunt. He wrote a book called The Undesigned Coincidences of the Gospels. And what is interesting about this is you often get an eyewitness who will tell you something, and you're thinking to yourself, really, how could that have even happened that way? It makes no sense what he's saying. Then a second eyewitness will come along and tell you something that fills in the gaps of the first eyewitness unknowingly, and that allows you to make sense of the more robust picture they're providing. And I was seeing very similar things that piqued my interest in the way the Gospels puzzle together in such a way that they provide a complete, robust, albeit messy at times, picture of what actually happened. That's very common when eyewitnesses talk about crime scenes. And so I started to research, well, what are the claims here? What does the early church say? For example, Papias, an early church father, who says that Mark's gospel is really, he's writing down what Peter's teaching about Peter's own observations with Jesus, and Papias says that Mark is making an effort to be very accurate, but not necessarily putting them in the proper order. Well, I wanted to say, is that possible? Is it possible for me to even examine forensically the Gospel of Mark to see if Peter's fingerprints are in there, you know? So I started to use things I did at work, you know, forensic statement analysis principles to investigate and dig through the Gospel of Mark, looking to see is there any good reason to believe in Papias' early claim. And as I did that, I became more and more confident that, yes, in fact, Peter's fingerprints were all throughout Mark. It does look to me as though Mark is chronicling an eyewitness account of Peter, just as Papias says. And that gave me great confidence going forward.
Talk about establishing a chain of custody. When I was a lawyer, and I remember hearkening back to law school, you learn about documents and exhibits, and you have to, in order to enter them into evidence, you have to have established the chain of custody to ensure that these indeed are the items that you're claiming they are. And so you took that principle, investigative principle of maintaining the integrity of the object to your own journey in faith. What happened there?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I always doubted as a skeptic, and I was a pretty adamant skeptic of the Bible until I was 35. I really felt like this has got to be a legend that's been corrupted over time. Somebody has been changing the story in the first 3 centuries before it gets to any council where someone's going to say, okay, this is the gospel we can trust. And I thought this got to be corrupted. So what I did is I went back and I said, is there a chain of custody? Is there somebody at the crime scene who takes a snapshot and then hands it to another officer who takes another snapshot, and they continue to do this until it gets to court? And then we know we've got a good chain of custody. That piece of evidence was at the crime scene is now the thing that's in court. And so I said, is it possible to do that with the Gospels? John appears to be writing about something he saw. He takes a picture. We call it the Gospel of John. Who's the next officer in the chain of command? It happens to be, in chain of custody, it happens to be Ignatius and Polycarp, his 2 students. They take a picture of Jesus because they write letters to their churches. 7 letters Ignatius wrote, 1 letter that Polycarp wrote to the Philippians, and he writes these letters and shows us a picture of Jesus, so I can compare that picture of Jesus to what John writes. And of course, they had a student, Irenaeus had a student, Hippolytus, and everyone's taking a snapshot, a Polaroid of Jesus. It turns out when you examine all the Polaroids, you're stuck with the Jesus that we know and love today. You're stuck very early on with the claims repeatedly over history that Jesus claimed to be God, walked, did all the miracles, rose from the dead. All the things that are the earliest claims of the church are maintained in this chain of custody. And that was important for me because it kind of dispels this idea that this is a legend that rose over time.
Well, we also have one piece of evidence, many pieces of evidence, buried in the catacombs of Rome. We have tens of thousands of holes in the ground, deep in the ground, in an elaborate cave system of Christians who were sacrificed rather than renounce Christ. I mean, they had a choice. They could have saved their lives or renounced Christ. And as you know, Peter gets hung upside down because he didn't think he deserved to be crucified as Christ was. So he's hung on the cross upside down. And under the chair of St. Peter that the Pope referred to a couple of days ago when he was talking about his resignation, they found what many biblical scholars believe are the bones of St. Peter, buried underneath the Vatican, directly underneath the chair of St. Peter, and right where the Roman circus was, where these people were all brutally killed rather than renounce Christ. And those catacombs, I don't know if you've been in them, they're fascinating.
No, I want to go. I was in Rome, and I desperately wanted to go. But I can tell you, I agree. This is an important piece of evidence. Look, Laura, you and I might die for our beliefs, but that would have zero evidential value because we are centuries behind the event. The people who actually saw it, though, if they're willing to die rather than change their story, that has great evidential value because they're the first eyewitnesses. So I think I always look at this and say, hey, what's the motive for this elaborate lie? There are only 3 motives I've ever identified in any homicide, any crime, any sin. Those are financial greed, sexual lust, or relational lust, and the pursuit of power. These are the 3 things that motivate all of us to do something we ought not do. I'm trying to figure out where is the motive in the disciples to do such a thing. And I think the more you learn about conspiracy theories and what makes them successful, and I've broken a number of conspiracies for murder, you realize that all the elements that need to be in place, and I write about this a little bit in the book, all the elements that need to be placed for a successful conspiracy are missing in the lives of the disciples in the first century. So I do agree with you. I think that the death of the apostles is without a doubt an important piece of evidence as we consider the puzzle.
We're talking to Jim Warner Wallace. His book, Cold Case Christianity, is really fascinating. I think the good thing about this book, no matter where you come from, whether you're non-denominational or Catholic or evangelical or fallen away from some faith, it's interesting because it's very accessible. I hate that's such a cliche, but it really is accessible. And so many people are fans of either the thriller genre or they're fans of the television special victims unit, Law and Order type things. And they already kind of know the lexicon of this type of writing and analysis, even if they didn't have the career like you have. And I think that might just bring more people into this, Jim. You know, that approach is very interesting, rather than just a pure scholarly approach.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm not a scholar, okay? I'm just a detective, okay? But I can tell you that I think all of us have an intuitive sense of how investigations are work. We watch enough TV. So what I just tried to do is give you put your hands around firmly 10 tools that I use to investigate cold cases, then apply those 10 tools to the Gospels to see if they're reliable. So I try to give you tools first, not just tell you what to think. I'm trying to help you know how to think.
Yeah, go down the path.
Yes, how do I go down that path? Exactly.
And do you like the show Cold Case, by the way?
You know, I love these shows, but I got to tell you, there are times like anybody else.
You want a break.
Lawyer shows, and you probably want to shoot yourself.
No,
right?
I never watch them.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I am too. I try not to watch those things because I'll find something to nitpick. So yeah, for the most part, I stay away from the TV shows. But I think this has got some aspect of that is in the book because it has to be, right, to do this kind of work.
Well, it's so great to talk to you, and I know we could just talk to you forever just about your experience and your career, which is fascinating, and so many people who have been victimized or had family members victimized by brutal criminals and feel like they have no hope of ever seeing closure or getting closure or seeing justice. There are homicide detectives and detectives all over this country who try to do the hard work of cracking these very old cases, these cold cases, and they do get solved. And I know that does an enormous amount of healing for the victims and their families. And so thank you for that. And thank you for writing this book. I love it. I think it's great.
Well, I'm indebted to you. I'm a big fan, as I said, and I'm so happy that we had a chance to talk today.
And it's our featured book on lauraingraham.com, Cold Case Christianity. And remember, Jim is a former atheist and saw the light. And I love the story. Jim Warner Wallace on The Laura Ingraham Show.